Now, the International Monetary Fund has lowered South Africa's growth for 2023 to 0.1%. It's because, in the main, to unreliable and inconsistent electricity supply. The fund is calling on SA to urgently implement reforms to create jobs and reduce inequality. Heidi Giokos joins us now from Washington to tell us more about IMF's findings. Heidi, the energy crises the country is facing again took center stage. Talk to us about what has been said there.
Yes, certainly. And I've just seen reports now from Eskom that the country will be in stage 6 rolling blackouts from 4 o'clock South African time until further notice. And this is the very reason why the IMF has revised South Africa's growth to 0.1% for 2023. This is a shocking number. It's basically little to no growth that South Africa will experience, and this is the forecast of the IMF. It's mostly attributed to the energy crisis, the IMF indicating that they did not expect the energy crisis to worsen, especially in the last quarter of 2022. And this is something that's been reiterated a number of times at the spring meetings here in Washington, D.C., that South Africa needs to get its house in order, especially when it comes to the energy crisis. How do you have an economy growing when you don't have consistent and reliable electricity supply? How do you, find a way to, have economic growth and job creation? It's a major crisis, and it's obviously something that needs to be addressed urgently. Let's just listen to what the IMF had to say yesterday in its Sub-Saharan Africa report.
So, on the growth projection, it's largely being influenced, of course, by the electricity production difficulties that the country is having. So I think that's by far the most important influence in the projections that we have. Of course, the external environment being difficult is a factor also. I think 0.1 is the number we have. We think other things being equal, probably the country will scrape through with a small expansion, but honestly, there's a big confidence interval around that.
Of course, the finance minister is also there, Heidi. He believes the situation will be brought under control to stabilize Eskom.
Yes, which is rather unusual, William, I would say, because look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment. We have stage 6. We had a whole electricity minister being appointed. The electricity minister has been rather frank about the unreliability of units at power stations after his visit to over 18 power stations about 2 weeks ago. But clearly this message is very different for the finance minister, rather optimistic, despite the energy crisis that we are facing. The finance minister telling me yesterday that, the energy crisis is something that even Europe is facing, but it's a very different energy crisis that Europe is facing. It's because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the reliability of energy from Russia. And this is now obviously impacting European countries. Our issue is very different. It's power utilities and power stations not operating to full capacity. There's a lot of issues around corruption. But the minister is saying that the IMF has painted a worst-case scenario. This is why they've revised down our growth rate by minus 1.1% to 0.1%. For 2023. That's a massive downward projection for South Africa, mostly because of our energy crisis. But the finance minister is saying we've got it under control. There are a number of factors that we have looked at and we are going to start implementing. There's also the issue of the over 200 billion rand debt relief that National Treasury is going to be taking over from Eskom. It's all interlinked, it's all intertwined. If you look at what's also happening with interest rates and inflation in South Africa, that's another big issue that the IMF is watching very closely, but that's also a global issue. We have been seeing interest rate hikes globally, which is obviously impacting inflation. But at the end of the day, South Africa has to keep its lights on. And before we listen to what the finance minister had to say, I must say that I'm flying back tomorrow, and I'm not looking forward to not having electricity, because here in Washington, D.C., there isn't any of that. It's normal. There in South Africa, it's not normal not to have electricity supply. And we as South Africans should not get accustomed to that, because our government has to urgently sort that out. Let's listen to Finance Minister on this.
Look, the challenge of energy security is not only a South African phenomenon. In South Africa, it takes a different form because its own goal, okay? Whereas other countries here, particularly European countries, are facing the energy crisis because of a different nature. So the energy crisis is a challenge for everybody. But let me come home. In the case of South Africa, there's always a difference in projection. For the first time, we have seen a difference between National Treasury and the Reserve Bank on exactly on the assumption of the intensity of load shedding. So, and are perfectly within in the IMF, they foresee intensity of the load shedding this year. They may be, from their perspective, correct in coming to that conclusion.
Heidi, just before we wrap up our conversation, obviously you're coming back to stage 5. Hopefully it will be stage 4 by the time you land here. And just as South Africans, we've felt the pinch, and it's going to be felt even more at the end of April when those debit orders start going off. I mean, my bond jumped from 12.5 to about 16,000 Rand. It's a serious thing, what is happening to just ordinary South Africans. And I imagine you'd want to just paint a picture what this actually mean for me as a South African, these news coming out of the IMF.
Yes, it's a very important point you touch on, because interest rate hikes are set to stabilize globally. This is something that, of course, we have been seeing across the globe, where interest rate hikes have obviously gone up. This is affecting you, William. As you mentioned, your bond moved from 12,000 Rand to 16,000 Rand. And you cannot separate inflation and interest rate hikes. Inflation is obviously increasing. People are struggling to buy basic food, basic essentials. So the two cannot be separated, and the IMF is calling for there to be a stabilization of both. Unfortunately, when inflation goes up, they have to also increase interest rate hikes. The IMF, however, has welcomed the interest rate hike, and it's a way to try and stabilize inflation. So they are, of course, trying to find more ways to bring this to normality, because if you increase inflation too much, there's going to be an issue of food insecurity, especially in countries across the African continent. It's a major concern. It was a huge talking point here at the spring meetings. And there's also concern, unfortunately, William, for a global recession, whether or not we are going to be able to recover. We mustn't forget what the COVID-19 pandemic, what impact that had on world markets, and us still trying to recover from that. And then you have the Russia-Ukraine conflict that, at the end of the day, does have an impact on us. So there are many, many issues here at play. And our government's also, of course, trying to find a way to mitigate that massive impact that you're feeling as a consumer. Before I go, William, I just want to also emphasize that we also got a chance to briefly speak to the Reserve Bank Governor of South Africa, Lesetja Kganyago, who has indicated that they are also not expecting much growth for South Africa. But at the end of the day, it's also their responsibility to not increase interest rate hikes too much. But they obviously have to look at both factors, interest rates as well as inflation. So unfortunately, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but buckle up, because it's going to get a little bit more rough, and hopefully it will stabilize by 2024.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That was eNCA reporter Heidi Giokos for us in Washington, D.C.